Thank you, Carrie. Thank you, Joe, for getting us recorded. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute's Board of Directors, welcome to today's Future of Engineering Roundtable. A big thank you to our donors who have made this session possible. I'm excited to introduce two of our very own this afternoon. First, we have Erin McLaughlin, ACEC's Vice President of Private Market Resources. Joining Erin is Joe Bates, who serves as a research consultant to the ACEC Research Institute. You may have seen this dynamic duo during the ACEC Fall Conference back in October, delivering an economic update. They have a lot of great information to share with you today from our recent research. And as two self-proclaimed data geeks, I'm sure they welcome your questions and comments. So please feel free to chime in the chat box and ask your questions, as Carrie indicated. Joe, Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thanks so much, Daphne. And Erin, it's great to see you again. Always enjoy presenting with you.
Yes, good to see you too.
Great. Well, let's get started here. So we have about 30 slides today that we're going to go over with all of you today. And we're going to break them up into three sections. The first section is, how did we get here? We're going to take a look at what's happened in the last 2 years, really, in terms of the economy and how we are in the situation we're in today and what is that situation. Then we're going to look at how is the AE industry doing today? And we'll be finally looking at what does the future hold. And throughout this presentation, we have economic data from the US government. We have private market data that Erin has collected, and we'll also be sharing some information from the second installment of the engineering business sentiment study. So 3 things sort of mashed up together throughout the presentation. So let's get right into it, Erin. How did we get here?
Yes.
Well, as many of you may know, we had a pandemic, and we don't have the actual the pandemic quarters in here. It's probably not really necessary to look at that. We know it was terrible. But in Q3 of 2020, we saw a huge snapback in GDP. And since then, you can see here, even though those bars are relatively smaller, they're still up around 5% with the exception of Q3 of last year. So the GDP, the economy is running really hot right now. It's doing really, really well. And it's actually been doing well in terms of the recovery from the pandemic. One real quick answer to a question. Yes, these slides will be made available. The presentation is being recorded and it will be available afterwards. All right, so we're doing really, really well in terms of our GDP and the recovery of the pandemic. You can also see this in a couple other metrics. When you look at the employment rate, so the number of people employed, and that's the blue line, and it's along the right axis. That blue line is in millions. It tells you how many millions of jobs we have. And during the not the Great Recession, that was a while back, but during the pandemic, we lost 22 million jobs. We were at around 152 million. We in 2 months lost 22 million jobs. It then took us until July 2022 to recover. So that's why that is circled there. Now, that's actually a very quick recovery. And Erin's going to show you some more data about how quick of a recovery we've made. But you also look at the unemployment rate, which is the sort of orange line here, and you see that it's down to 3.8%. That's exactly where it was right before the pandemic started. So, and we've also surpassed the number of jobs now that we had during right before the pandemic. So, GDP is great, jobs are recovering, unemployment rate is very low.
Absolutely, Joe. And as our members know, it's not just low overall, it's very low in our industry. So when we look at professional services under the category of management, professional, and related occupations, we see that our industry, which falls in that category's unemployment rate is 2.2%. So what this means is that we have an incredibly tight labor market, more so than ever before, at a time when we are experiencing that sort of rapid growth.
I think what underscores this really tight labor market is not just the unemployment rate, Erin, but this is probably the more important slide when we talk about what's happening in the labor market today. So we've recovered more jobs than we lost. The unemployment rate is back where it was. So you'd think, oh, we should be in good shape. But this is why we're not in good shape. This really points to the problem with the lack of workers that we had and the really tight labor market. So it's kind of interesting here. The effects of the baby boomers retiring can be seen since the Great Recession, right? And what's interesting though is that we've sort of hit the tail end of that, and then the millennials have come back into the work, or have started to come into the workforce, and that's what you started to see in the last 5 years. But then the pandemic hit, and the problem is that we're still below the labor force participation rate that we were at prior to the pandemic. That's the real problem.
Right. And as you said, Joe, most of that is about demographics. It's not necessarily about social or monetary policy. It is about the baby boomer generation being very large, the millennial generation being very large, but Generation X, which sits in between, is much smaller. And so as folks are resigning, the Great Resignation, and exiting the workforce, which may have sped up during the pandemic since the stock market was still hot overall, although we're experiencing some volatility now, and, maybe coming back to work and masking up and doing things differently wasn't as appealing. So, concepts of full employment, which is generally has been seen at about 2%, are being revisited. Are we really at full employment? And certainly within our sector in professional services, we're already around 2%. So it really is a matter now of sort of the pipeline and what to do with the pipeline that exists for labor.
And there definitely are people who exited the labor force during the pandemic and have decided to not come back. Not just the baby boomers who, as Erin said, some of them decided to just retire early. But for instance, we know that over 1 million working mothers left the labor force during the pandemic because they had to care for their children. Not all of them have come back, and we might not see them come back for quite some time.
Right, because a lot of support services, daycares, elder care, and so forth have also had constrained labor. And so it affects all different aspects of our economy.
Yeah, there's a statistic I have for you from Erin that I didn't put in this presentation, but it's from the year 2020. The turnover rate in jobs, almost 60% of workers turned over that year in 2020. Now, we know a lot of that was because people got laid off during the pandemic, but what it means is they didn't go back to those same jobs. So again, just a lot of disruption that exacerbated this historic trend of lower participation rate in terms of labor. All right, so this is some of the data we collected from the business sentiment survey that we most recently conducted in the first quarter. And this just adds more data to the fact that we have a very tight labor market. You can see here that 9 out of 10 firms that we surveyed, and we surveyed about 600, indicated that their average employee salary increased. So that's all 9 out of 10. That's a lot. And Erin, you were saying to me that you don't feel that having increases is really all that unusual in this space.
Yeah, I think a lot, within the engineering space, a lot of firms had small furloughs at the beginning of the pandemic caused recession, or perhaps they froze wage increases in 2020. So the idea that our member firms, engineering firms, gave increases, and that 9 out of 10 firms we surveyed gave increases in 2021 is really not a surprise. What is a surprise is how much of an increase our member firms are giving their employees. So, as Joe shared, we had 90% of firms give an increase within the last year, but it's that percentage of salary increase that is very, very surprising. So, and again, this is not for new employees, this is for total employees. So the concept, you can see by our bar charts that we started at less than 4% and go up from there. And, as many of our members listening know, most increases that we build into our pricing for our clients is not even at 4% on an annual basis. And so this is really creating, as I said to Joe during our practice session, this is the most interesting slide we're probably going to show today. This is really creating a very difficult situation within our industry where we are having to compete for workers. We're at basically a 2% unemployment. We have workers just maybe changing firms and even working for the same clients, but we're having to pay them more. And then we're going to have to go back and pay maybe workers that haven't been changing more in order to sort of even things up. And that's creating, a spiral, a wage spiral up that is not as easily solvable by simply raising prices due to the way our contracts are structured, particularly for large public or large national clients.
Yeah, once you've given somebody a raise or you've given them a base salary when they've joined your organization, you can't reverse that, right? I mean, unless you start to get into issues of another recession or a pandemic or something of that nature. And these are really historically high numbers. Now, we don't have data from this survey for last year or the prior year, but what's really interesting is if you just sort of put this into a broader context, for the last decade, firms, not just firms, but the economy-wide sort of average baked in increase was around 2 to 3% in terms of wages and salaries. And if you just sort of think, well, as Erin said, in escalation clauses, you typically don't have more than 3%. This is phenomenal, right? I mean, this is a lot of wage pressure, a lot of increases. That's just adding fuel to the fire. And that's, as Erin said, that's wage inflation. This here is just inflation of goods and services. This is overall. When I put the draft deck of this together, we had January data, and I was calling out January data at 7.5%. And then we got February in the last couple of weeks, and I had, okay, well, now we're up even higher. So we have not seen inflation rates overall like this since 1981. And we passed that mark. If you look here at about 5% or so, 4.5%, 5%, that was last year, summer of last year. That's the highest we were during the Great Recession, and that was pretty high. Once we passed that, we were in territory for the last 9 months that we had not seen since the early 80s. So we heard a lot of talk about transitory inflation last summer, and the government officials were saying, oh, it's temporary. Well, many of us thought it's not temporary, that we saw that this was not going to subside, and in fact, it hasn't. And so the fact that the Fed has not increased rates prior to now is a little surprising, seeing as we've only seen continued upward pressure from the inflation.
So what's really interesting here is that we have been following Fed Chair Jerome Powell, because when it comes to monetary policy, how we as a country deal with inflation and deal with maximum employment, that's the role of the Fed. That's essentially their dual mandate. And so Fed Chair Powell testifies twice a year before the Senate House Banking Committee. He did so earlier this month in March, and he indicated that, unlike earlier this year, when many thought, he might propose an interest rate of, 0.5 point up, he would only be doing 1/4 point. Now, the Fed meets later this week, and so we'll be hearing a lot about interest rates in the business news and other news. But that 0.5 point is really to try to slow the economy down. Now, this is a very unusual situation as the world has entered a war, essentially, with Russia invading Poland. And so I thought it was very interesting that he acknowledged to the House Financial Services Committee and within his testimony that he's going to avoid adding uncertainty to what is already an extraordinarily challenging and uncertain moment. And really, it's that concept of how the Fed deals with interest rates in order to combat employment pressures and inflation pressures, which you'll hear analysts refer to as either a soft landing or a hard landing. You know, we have this boom coming out of our pandemic caused recession. It's too hot. And in order to slow it down, are we going to come down soft or are we going to come down hard with the possibility of a recession? And so, you know, those are the questions that we're hearing and we're seeing. And this is a very interesting moment, you know, obviously for us to be analyzing the data of both our industry and the macro data as we look at what's going to happen in the near and long term.
And I think, you know, that really is the quandary of what we're going to see from the Fed in terms of policy is we have this overheating economy. It's for sure overheating, but now we've gotten this war and there's tons and tons of sanctions that are being levied against Russia. So, you know, I think it's almost anyone's guess as to what's going to happen in the next, you know, 3 to 6 months. All right, so that's how we've got here. That's where we are. Now let's take a look at how the AE industry is doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first chart I wanted to show everyone as we talk about sort of the most recent past and us coming out of the pandemic recession is a quarterly snapshot of AE revenues that's tracked by the Census Bureau. So essentially it's the revenues in our industry domestically in the US. So you can see, you know, our all-time peak had actually been in Q4 of 2019, right before the pandemic and the shutdowns began at the end of Q1 in 2020. Then we did dip down in Q2 2020. But since then, we've had 6 straight quarters of growth. And so as soon as we sort of, you know, about halfway through last year came up above Q4 2019, we basically were back in a, you know, post-pandemic growth mode. And in Q4 2021, which is the data that just came out a couple of weeks ago, was the first quarter that our industry revenues have surpassed $100 billion. So things are very, very strong for our industry.
We've definitely bounced back much more quickly than anyone anticipated. Even our own economists who were forecasting a recovery for this industry, we wildly surpassed expectations.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, you know, I like to share a little bit of a historical version of how we came back from the Great Recession, which was obviously caused by many different dynamics, including the main dynamic of housing, which impacts infrastructure and impacts real estate. And, you know, the housing crisis really occurred in that second half of 2008. And then we were very, very flat as an industry until about 2013 and 14, when we really started to see that growth. So, you know, obviously it's very, very encouraging that we have rebounded so quickly, completely different kind of recession with a different cause. But so it's very interesting to see that historical perspective. And just to note, you know, that those controls around residential growth will hopefully keep us from having that sort of same recession in the future.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that in the current period, we're talking about quarters, but you know, 12 years ago, we were talking about years. Yes. So I think that really underscores the difference of this recession. So what we see is from the business sentiment survey very much is reflecting what we're seeing in all this data. And of course, you can imagine that these 600 people who answered this survey are not spending quite as much time as Erin and I are looking at all this, you know, macroeconomic data, but the firms are sensing that there's a problem with the US economy. So we use what's called a net rating. And this net rating takes the percentage of people who are expressing negative views and subtracts that from the percent who are expressing positive views. So this is the net, again, the net rating. So we had a plus 40 the last quarter, and in one quarter, in 3 months' time, the sentiment regarding the US economy overall has declined by 11 points. That's a pretty significant decline. On the flip side, we're still seeing very positive sentiment regarding the industry as well as firms' finances. And in fact, each of those metrics increased. Mm-hmm. And we know why, and you all know why, and we're going to show you the charts in a few minutes. But I think it's really remarkable that we're seeing this bifurcation of what's happening with the economy overall and what's happening within our industry.
Well, yeah, and one data point that we use to track everything is construction put in place. So these are numbers that are released monthly and annually, and we have the revised annual numbers now that compare 2021 over 2020. So this includes both design and construction spending. We can see that last year we grew just over 8% from the previous year, but that was really attributed to the strong growth in residential, private residential, which was up over 23%. So, this is not just about housing prices, but this is about the actual creation of new residences, new homes. And in 2020, that number had actually been up from 2019. So, the home building in the residential market it slowed down a little bit early in the pandemic, but it never went backwards. Now compare that to, unfortunately, non-residential private markets, which, include commercial real estate, healthcare, et cetera. Those overall have had a decline of about 2% last year compared to 2020. That 2% number got better as the year went on. It was much lower. And so that's the average for last year. But public spending on design and construction actually followed private and sort of went down a little bit later. And we do think that will certainly come back with passage of the infrastructure bill. So we're not too worried about that. But a lot of states and localities had sort of tightened up their reins early in the pandemic. And of course, they cannot run deficits the way that the federal government can. But as sort of the CARES Act and other federal stimulus has come through to them, they have begun spending money again. So in the most recent months of 2021, we have seen an improvement in public spending as well.
Just a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A or the chat box. We're happy to field those as they come in, and we'll also have time at the end of the presentation.
Absolutely. So now when we dig a little bit deeper to say, hey, what was hot and what was cold in 2021 versus 2020, most of these are not really too much of a surprise. So obviously we talked about residential being the hottest category of all design and construction markets at just over 23%. That was followed by manufacturing, which is not a market category that usually has been so strong, but because of initiatives by our current president and our previous president to sort of bring manufacturing back into the US, and frankly, by a lot of the supply chain issues that we've had, issues with the chip shortage, there's obviously a desire to rebuild manufacturing in the US. And then that follows sewage and waste disposal, which is water, wastewater. Now, a lot of that is sort of upgrading water systems in the US, but it's also water systems that, are part of what I call community infrastructure that surrounds such a strong residential growth. And then that's followed by commercial, which includes residential as well as healthcare. And our cold markets are really those that will be no surprise to our audience, that where folks could not social distance. So there's a lack of revenues that would, bring about more design and construction and growth within those markets. So public safety, which includes corrections, saw the sharpest decline. And some of that is also due to us rethinking after some of the social justice conversations that really took off in 2020, how we approach the corrections market, which had largely been P3. up until fairly recently. And then we have lodging, and a lot of that is about business travel not returning, followed by conservation and development, which is levees, stormwater management, and then religious and education, which again, those are asset classes, property types where if you don't have revenue coming in because you cannot have people concentrated on campuses and in buildings, that's really where the impact is. We do think obviously some of these categories, particularly conservation and development, will see more of an upside in years going forward.
I think what's really interesting to me, Erin, is, you're looking at actual data, market data,
right.
And in the survey that we have conducted, we're getting sentiment. So what I am pleased to see is that we're seeing sentiment is tracking very nicely with this data that we're seeing in the marketplace. And when you look at the sentiment by sector, this is more recent than the data that you were showing, Erin. So this is saying to me, if these two really are in tune, we're continuing to see very strong markets by sector, particularly the ones that you were talking about. So what we have here on this slide is the Q4 sentiment data, and these are net ratings again, compared to Q1 data. And I've circled in blue the ones that are the highest for this quarter. So you can see science and technology, healthcare facilities, water and wastewater, data centers. So these are all sort of hitting on some of those areas that you just talked about. And then when you look at the change from the previous quarter, these are other areas that you were hitting on, Erin, particularly transportation, real estate, both commercial as well as residential, again, transportation and energy utilities, just lots of these are doing much better in the current sentiment than they were even 3 months ago.
Right.
And of course, to the point of your data, education down there towards the bottom of the list, and also one of the lowest numbers in terms of net rating is the justice sector and the conventions and centers and sports facilities. So again, really tying nicely into the data. And if these, over time, we'll know if these are correlated. We don't have enough data points yet, but it seems like they're tracking fairly well right now.
Absolutely. The thing I like to say is, human behavior drives the design of our built environment, and usually we see that stretched out over years as we analyze trends. But in this moment, the pandemic caused so much of our behavior to change and then even change going forward. But we can clearly see how human behavior and what's important, including data centers, with all of us still, many of us working from home more than we did before, or streaming over devices, entertainment, and so forth. The need for data centers and different kinds of data centers is certainly increased, And so it really is about how human behavior impacts the design of our environment at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think this is one of the unique industries where you really can see that impact. What's happening around us is reflected in this data.
Well, this is a pie chart that I love to share with our members, just to remind them that we design all aspects of the built environment. So obviously, many of our firms focus on the largest market, which is transportation, coming in at 19% last year of design and construction spending. But power, at 14%, and then education at 12%, commercial at 11%, and so forth, are other really large markets where so much of our domestic monies are, invested in design and construction. And there's so much activity for our member firms in both a, vertical and horizontal environments and markets. And we track all of them at ACEC.
All right, so there's a couple other metrics that we were measuring in the sentiment survey. One of them is current backlog. And just as a point of reference, when we were conducting the pandemic COVID surveys that you all may recall, and we did about, I think, 9 of those, the lowest point that we saw in terms of backlog, the median firm backlog, was at 6 months. We've seen that steadily increase over the last year or so. And so we're at a really good, healthy point. And not only are we maintaining, that median, but we're seeing the average is increasing. So whereas last quarter, 41% of firms reported a backlog of at least a year. We now have 45% of firms reporting a backlog of at least a year. So we are definitely continuing to move in the right direction. One of the other points I want to make is that we didn't really have time to put into this presentation today and to share with you all a lot of subgroup data, but we do have this data in the full report by size of firm, and also by geographic region. And one of the big trends that we saw this quarter versus last quarter is that the smaller firms have finally made up that ground that they lost during the pandemic overall. You know, even last quarter, we saw that larger firms were reporting more positive ratings, larger backlogs, you know, more hiring, but we're now in this quarter, just in 3 months, we've seen a really big surge of the smaller firms catching up to the same levels as the larger firms. So I think that's really encouraging as well. The other thing that we're tracking is the open position. So this gets at the labor issue. We've seen that increase even over last quarter. Last quarter, 87% of firms reported at least one staff opening. I didn't think it could get any higher. We're now at 90%. That's honestly, it's phenomenal. I've been doing research like this for a very long time, and I've never seen a labor market so hot and so tight. So, you know, this really just tells you. And here's the other thing, Erin, when we look at firms with more than 500 FTE, the median number of open positions went from 60 to 80 in 3 months. It's remarkable. It's almost hard to believe. I did double check the data, by the way.
Well,
Right.
I mean, it's what does the future hold? It holds a tight labor market, essentially. That's one of our responses. You know, that kind of response that we saw in our survey, we expect that we will see that again. And really one of the main reasons for that is, even if we have a little bit of a hard landing and things, you know, are not growing as fast, or we slip back a little bit, we have, you know, the once in a generation spend of the infrastructure bill. And so that is going to continue to feed our member firms, and it's going to have a ripple effect. So, you know, we at the ACEC Research Institute work closely with economic folks at Rockport Analytics, and they developed a scenario for us that once it passed, what did it mean? And what it really means is that there will be 82,000 more jobs supported over the 5-year period by the infrastructure bill. And, you know, that it will also result, obviously, in 132 billion in increased AE output over the next 5 years. So great news for our member firms that hopefully, you know, when you think back to that annual chart that I showed earlier with the AE revenues that we've been, you know, every single year we've climbed since 2014, and we expect that to continue. So we got to get our pipeline in order, and, you know, and just sort of to break it out, you know, what kind of spending are we going to see by market sector with the infrastructure bill, AKA IIJA, if we don't have enough acronyms in the world. And this is, you know, these are the markets that we really see are going to get the most attention. And interestingly enough, it's a combination of both public and private clients. So, you know, the lion's share of it is going for transportation, but all different kinds of transportation measures. You know, I remarked, you know, back in our sentiment survey slide, you saw airports, you know, suddenly had ranked high. And, you know, that's one of the categories that's getting a lot of attention from the infrastructure bill, for us to have a modern first class infrastructure in the US. And then, of course, you know, roads and bridges. This is the largest funding, I believe, of rail at one time that we've ever seen in the US. So most of it will go for passenger rail, but some of it will also go for freight rail. And then we have our ports and waterways. And, you know, a lot of that money especially is going to help shore up our supply chain infrastructure, which has been under such a strain over the last couple of years. And then, of course, measures for us to reach the climate goals that so many of our states, localities, and private companies have put in place. How do we get to net zero by 2030 or 2050, knowing that transportation and buildings are the largest emitters of carbon in the world, those two sectors, the sectors that we design. So, we have electric vehicle charging, reconnecting communities, and then money is going specifically to the power and grid and resiliency, which will also help combat some of the climate change and the carbon emissions pressure that our clients are under. And then, of course, broadband will be deployed. Some of that money is allocated for affordability measures, but the majority of the money is for actual deployment of rural broadband. And then, of course, we have pollution, which is largely about funding the Superfund and brownfield remediation efforts, as well as potential redevelopment. And then Western Water, helping to tackle, the drought issues that we face in a lot of the Western areas of the US.
I think one of the things that interests me, Erin, is the whole idea of moving to more electric vehicles. And while that's not going to happen overnight, and it can certainly be affected by who's in charge in Washington, we are definitely seeing that consumers and corporations more and more and more are moving towards electric transportation. So, there may be some ups and downs, fits and starts there, but I do think, just looking at the data, that is definitely going to be something to watch in the future.
Yeah, and I think our geopolitical moment, that we're in right now, which a lot of our, surveys that we track haven't necessarily captured that exactly, because we're just a couple weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but we're already seeing how it's disrupted the oil market. And at the end of the day, the only way to solve geopolitical and international issues that that create that kind of oil market disruption is for us to use a fuel source that anyone can create, any country can create. And so, it's going to take us a while. And certainly oil, for our member firms that do oil and have oil and gas clients, it's not going away, especially for commercial vehicles and airplanes. But of course, for passenger vehicles and for a lot of utilities that are doing a lot more solar and offshore wind, I don't think anything that's happening, certainly in the last couple of weeks, is going to slow that down. It's just going to speed it up.
Yeah, and there are short-term policy implications, as you said, Erin, but the long-term trend is to, I would characterize it as a more diverse sourcing of energy. I think you hit that right there. So when we look at some of what people are saying about the IIJA from the sentiment survey, we're getting overall positive responses, but also some concerns. Again, keep in mind here, we have an overheating economy, we have a labor shortage, we have inflation increasing, and now you're supercharging all that with the IIJA. Well, on the one hand, if you look at that middle bar, we see that 62% of firms are saying that, yeah, I think that the IIJA will increase project opportunities for my firm. And 20% are saying the opposite. But again, that net rating on balance, almost half are saying, yeah, it's going to be good for my firm. Now, what's interesting is you look at the top bar and you say, oh, I'm extremely concerned about inflation. And there's a lot of people that are very concerned about inflation. So taking those two together really helps to understand the last statement. The IIJA will greatly increase profitability at my firm. And there you have a lot of people saying, nope, I don't think so. And almost the same saying, yeah, I agree.
I think this might tie our other slide for the most interesting slide. And I think this tells a story about really project management and risk management. So, our member firms, especially those that work in the public sector, which might be the 62% that say, of course, the infrastructure bill is going to create more project opportunities. That's a no-brainer. However, am I going to be more profitable as a result? Well, go back to that slide. If everybody's getting a 4% or higher increase, that's a real challenge. In our industry, we're not selling widgets, we're selling people. So, if inflation is wage inflation, and if folks are getting raises and we even if they're not changing jobs, how do I keep my project costs under control? And how do I know how and when to raise my prices, and at what percentage level? And so, those are really the questions. It's not going to be a lack of work that our members in the engineering industry is confounded with, but it's how to price the work and how to manage project controls and labor prices in order to be profitable.
I think also, Erin, how to leverage technology.
Right.
We're doing a lot of work on that area, in terms of the ACEC Research Institute and looking at how firms are using technology.
Right.
That could certainly help. And we do see larger firms are taking more advantage of that than smaller firms right now. But a lot of things going on right now.
A lot of potential solutions, how to use technology and how to perhaps access different labor pools or folks with different skill sets to have different kinds of roles on projects. So maybe the burden isn't always, on an engineer or a PE or a registered architect or so forth to do some of the project controls and the more administrative functions that are involved in our billable work. So.
And we've also talked a lot about how, the AE industry is becoming more commoditized. So then, well, how do you change that? How do you get more creative? How do you keep from being a commodity? So there's a lot of changes, I think, that are kind of coalescing here all at one time. Now, when we look at the future of the industry and the economy, overall sentiment is lower. When we ask, what do you think will be happening 12 months from now? Sentiment's definitely lower than it is right now. So that's indicating, some concerns. And when it comes to the US economy, we see that future sentiment turned negative in the last 3 months. So this again means more firms feel that the US economy will be doing worse 12 months from now than will be doing better. So that's how to sort of interpret the net rating. But regardless, we're still seeing very strong future optimism in terms of the industry and firm finances. And we know why, right? It's the IIJA. We're getting that support from that passed through that bill. And I think that's going to really help carry this industry through whatever difficult times we see on the macroeconomic front. So in terms of market sectors, we still see very strong sentiment overall, but you'll notice there are more declines in the future sentiment than what we saw with current sentiment. So now they're not huge declines, but some of the largest declines are convention centers and sports facilities, energy and utilities and telecommunications. So maybe not as strong sentiment there, but the areas that are the strongest overall, again, are circled in blue. So we have water and wastewater, we have airports, roads and bridges, transit. So these are all those things that you talked about, Erin, in terms of where that money is going to be spent.
Right. So our firms, their sentiment, which reflects what's happening in our market when we looked at our design and construction spending, is that, the markets that are hot right now are not necessarily going to be the ones hot in 12 months. And in 12 months, it will really reflect, hopefully, the money and the funding that we see come out of IIJA.
Yeah, we saw hints of this 3 months ago in the prior quarter, but we're seeing it's even moving more in that direction now. So but again, the overall news here is just very strong and positive sentiment for the industry. When we look at backlog expectations 12 months from now, we're also continuing to see optimistic into future anticipation of that. So 66% of firms think that their backlog will increase 12 months from now. And that's up a couple percentage points from the last quarter. So again, still moving in the right direction and very, very strong. And when we look at hiring growth expectations, so this is, we already talked about all the firms that are hiring now and the number of positions they have open now. And on top of that, we're seeing even higher growth expectations going forward. So it's pointing to more and more growth, more tightness in the labor market, potentially, as you were talking about, Erin, more wage inflation. So these are all things that that firms need to be aware of in the coming months.
Absolutely.
All right, so we have some time for questions, and we're happy to take those questions now. So please feel free to enter them into the Q&A or the chat. We'd love to hear from you. We would hate to waste the time we have here. Erin, this is just a question that I have for you, and I love throwing hard questions at you.
I'm ready.
So some of that data you were talking about in terms of where we are now, where do you see us going in terms of the residential market? What are you anticipating that private market data is going to look like in terms of 2022 versus 2021? Are we still going to see, the residential pushing
Well, that's a great question, Joe. And for our audience, we didn't practice this part. So, seeing 23% year-over-year growth that we saw with 2021 over 2020, no, we're not going to see that continue, because it's really a pace that it is almost, you can't continue it. However, there is a demand for housing, and that goes back to demographics, knowing that we have a big baby boomer population, a smaller Gen X, and a much bigger millennials. And our oldest millennials are now entering their early 40s. So they are truly, late 20s to early 40s. They are at that age. In 2019 was the first year that they took out more, they initiated more mortgages than any other generation in 2019. So, we're going to see, we have a demand for housing in this country that is not going to be satisfied within the next year or two. It's going to continue. And will the rise of interest rates that we know is going to happen, because it has to happen to slow our wage price inflation spiral? Yes, it's going to happen, and it will slow it down a little bit, but it's not a bubble, and that's what I think. And that's what most analysts in macroeconomics, and we had a private market symposium earlier this month where we had a couple true experts in residential forecasting say that, it's not a bubble, but of course it will slow down. But for our firms that do land development, it won't be this crazy forever, but it will not be a recession anywhere near like we saw the Great Recession. It will be a slowdown, but hopefully nothing like a bubble.
And I think another interesting point, Erin, is when you look at the public sector, and you talked about how that declined year over year in 2021. And we obviously have the IIJA, so we're expecting that public sector to increase. But it's interesting to look back a year ago when the question was, okay, if the federal government passes all of these funds, will the states have the money to do the matching that they need to match, to take advantage of those funds? And one of the positive things that I'm seeing in many states is that states are starting to run surpluses much further ahead than what they had projected because of this very strong economy. So to me, that points out that, okay, those concerns that we had last year are probably, again, overall are not there.
So, when we think about how state and local governments collect their revenue, it's through property taxes, they're going up, sales taxes, people are buying more stuff, that's why we have a supply chain issue, and income tax, people are earning more. So yes, states and localities, while there was a lot of angst early in the pandemic recession, they have recovered because their coffers are full, and these percentages that they're receiving have not gone down. So
and the other aspect is, some states levy their gas tax as a percentage, and so of course those states are going to see additional windfalls coming up here.
We don't have enough time today to talk about the gas tax.
Right.
And there is some short-term, we've gotten some questions from members, and there's definitely a lot out there about states perhaps trying to eliminate or basically furlough how they collect their own gas taxes. And that's something that ACEC is watching very, very closely, because obviously, that is one way. There are other ways that infrastructure is funded in the US. But overall, the states needing to do some sort of match in order to receive these federal funds has not become more of a problem exiting out of the pandemic, because they have not run they're running surpluses in many cases, and they're still collecting a lot of or more tax revenue.
Yeah, we have another question here from the audience, and again, I encourage anyone to ask questions that have them. We showed the forecast, and so that the question is, we know that the forecast will increase because of the IIJA passage, but what's going to happen to our forecast with the prospect of war in Europe and sanctions and any further supply chain disruptions that may occur, and what happens if we have to levy sanctions against China? I don't know that we have the answer to that yet. Those are all very open questions. So the good news, as we pointed out, is that the IIJA is going to provide us with some cushion, right? So go ahead, Erin.
I've heard a lot of economists describe this moment as the moment when the negatives of globalism become a reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
So many of us have benefited from the positives of globalism, but not being able to import things the same way, as I'm sure most of our listeners today have been following the same news that we have. We don't import a lot of oil and gas from Russia ourselves in the US. We are a net exporter. We became a net exporter a couple of years ago of energy. However, it's a global market, right? And the same thing is for goods, and that's one of the reasons the residential market has been constrained. A lot of our home builder clients couldn't get appliances in, and those come from Asia. So, we are truly live in such an interconnected global world. And that's one of the reasons it's so interesting to come into this moment, because it's not a moment that we don't have a go by moment to look at. So.
Yeah. We'll have to monitor these things, and of course, we will be providing an updated forecast by the end of the year. And so we're going to keep track of this, and we will keep you all informed of what's happening. We also will be continuing to collect quarterly data from the sentiment study. Erin, you're going to continue to collect your monthly and quarterly private market data. So I fully anticipate we will be doing this on the regular, and definitely keep an eye out for the survey that we send you after this. We'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear what you think, and if there's other things we can include in our presentation next time. But that's almost it. We're going to turn it back over to Daphne for some closing remarks. And thank you so much for being here today. We really enjoyed this opportunity.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, Joe and Erin. I warned you at the onset, they love this data and could go on for probably another 2 hours, but appreciate all of the insights you have given us, a lot to think about. And thanks to each of you for joining us today. We do want to give a special shout out to our Institute donors who have made this roundtable possible. We invite each of you to think about and consider how you and or your firm might want to support the Institute and our efforts moving forward. We also have here the QR code that will give you full access to the reports that Joe shared with you today, the sentiment report and some other economic reports from the Institute. So feel free to scan that while we have it up. We will be sending you a short evaluation, as Joe mentioned. Please share your experience with us. Let us know how we did, what else we could provide for you. And I hope you all have a wonderful and safe afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Be well.